Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We are so delighted to see all these numbers already in attendance, and the numbers are climbing. Welcome. Hello. It's 5 o'clock on the dot, so I'm just going to wait for a few more people to join us. If you are looking for Portal, the Scholarly Center of the National Portrait Gallery, you're in the right place. I am Kate Lemay, and I use pronouns she, her. And I am the acting senior historian at the National Portrait Gallery and the interim director of Portal, which is the Portrait Gallery's Scholarly Center. I have the pleasure of coordinating this program along with the assistance of Jackie Petito, and we have a great program for you tonight. Thank you so much for joining us for today's program, Portraits of Promised Lands, in conversation with Ying-chen Peng and Philip Tinari. Dr. Dorothy Moss will moderate the conversation. And I should say that the exhibition that Dorothy curated, which is a retrospective of Hung Lu's Portraiture, is now on view at the Portrait Gallery. So we hope that you will all come to the museum and see this very important exhibition. Dr. Moss will, as I said, moderate the conversation. And I've been in long conversations with Dorothy as she's been curating this exhibition. And hearing her talk about it has been one of the pleasures of being colleagues with someone like Dorothy. And through Dorothy, I feel like I've really gotten to know this exhibition. So like I said, I'm so excited to be able to share a little bit more about the exhibition with you tonight. I think the numbers have climbed. It's great to see everyone. If you want to place into the chat from where you're zooming in from, we'd love to see the different places that people are connecting with us from. And I'm sure that people are eager to share too. So if you use the chat function, you can see, hi from Toronto, DC, Michigan, Canada. Oh, Hawaii, great. Silver Spring, Mexico, Berkeley, California, Indiana, Australia. It's wonderful. So please continue to put into the chat from where you're zooming in from, and I'm going to get us started. Before we begin, we would like to extend our condolences to the friends and the family of Hung Lu, whose extraordinary artistic vision reminds us that even in the midst of despair, there is hope. And when people help each other, there is joy. She believed in the power of art and portraiture to change the world. I'd also like to give a land acknowledgement. Although we are tuning in together from very different places, as you can see in the chat, we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home in these places today. I also want to make sure that we recognize that we understand the inherent flaws of portraiture. Since this nation's founding, who is represented and how one is represented reflects the country's flaws, as well as its strengths. The National Portrait Gallery, we strive to present a more complete narrative, one that acknowledges the history of slavery, racism, and inequality in the United States. We are so pleased to present today's event as part of the Greenberg-Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture. We extend our gratitude to Susan Steinhauser and her late husband, Dan Greenberg, the sponsors for tonight's program, for their generosity, which makes this ongoing virtual conversation series possible. So thank you to Susan. A little bit of ground guidelines for the Zoom format. Please use the chat function. Many of you already are, so thank you. Let us know from where you're watching. We'd love to see the diversity in our audiences. And you can also use it to make comments, connections to your own ideas as you listen. That is very welcome. You should use the Q&A feature to submit your questions, however. That is what Dr. Moss will be looking at for the moderation of the conversation in order to bring in your questions. So please use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom right of your screen, to ask your questions, pose your questions there, and Dr. Moss will use that to guide her questions. I now have the pleasure of introducing our guests. Dr. Ying-chen Peng specializes in late imperial and modern Chinese art history with a focus on gender issues and globalization of material culture. Before joining the American University, she worked at the National Palace Museum and the Academia Sinica, both in Taiwan, as well as the Metropolitan Museum of Art as a pre-doctoral research fellow. Dr. Peng earned her PhD degree from the University of California at Los Angeles in 2014. And she has a forthcoming book titled Artful Subversion, Empress Dowager He Xi's Image Making in Art, which will be published by Yale University Press. Her current research projects include the gendered aspects of fin de siècle ceramic collecting in England, as well as the United States, and also the impact of genes on the modernization of femininity in East Asia, which I love. Philip Tinari is director and CEO of the UCCA Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing, one of China's leading institutions of contemporary art. Since joining in 2011, he has led its transformation from a founder-owned private museum into an accredited museum across multiple locations, a public foundation, and a family of art-driven enterprises. From 2009 to 2012, he founded and edited Leap, the first internationally distributed bilingual magazine of contemporary art in China. Having written extensively on contemporary art in China, he was co-curator of the 2017 exhibition, Art and China After 1989, Theater of the World, at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York. He holds degrees from Duke and Harvard. Our moderator for this evening's conversation is Dr. Dorothy Moss, Portrait Gallery Curator of Painting and Sculpture. In 2015, Dr. Moss initiated the Portrait Gallery's first performance series, Identify, which included 10 commissioned performances by internationally recognized artists, including Jeffrey Gibson, Maria Magdalena Campos Pons. Dr. Moss's past exhibitions include directing the 2013, 2016, and 2019 Outwin Boochever portrait competitions. And the exhibitions, Sweat of Their Face, Portrayals of American Workers, which was co-curated with David Ward, as well as One Life, Sylvia Plath. Her latest exhibition is on view right now, Hung Lu, Portraits of Promised Lands. So I hope that you all get to see it. The exhibition's accompanying catalog is published by Yale University Press. It's also available now. We're going to put the link in the chat for you to check it out. We hope you do. Dr. Moss's upcoming exhibitions include One Life, Violin, which is scheduled to open next year in 2022. And she also co-curated a contemporary portraiture exhibition, Kinship, which opens in 2022 as well. Oh my goodness, so all this is so much information. Let's turn to the conversation itself. We're so excited. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Dorothy Moss.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you, Jackie, for organizing this event. And thank you to Philip Tinari and Ying-chen Peng for being our esteemed guests and panelists. I am so honored to have worked closely with Hung Lu for the past 3 years on this exhibition. She was involved in every aspect of the planning and organizing for the exhibition. We worked hard together and we had fun together, and I miss her dearly. I also want to thank her husband, art writer and critic, Jeff Kelly, who I hope is with us tonight. He was instrumental also in the planning of this exhibition. I was lucky enough to spend Hung's last week with her in Oakland, California, where she, Jeff, and I spent time in the golden light of their deck in Oakland, California, talking and looking at exhibition images as the exhibition was installed in early August. And I was able to share with Hung Lu the power of her artwork in the context of Washington. Her artwork puts migrants, workers, refugees, orphans, prostitutes, those who have been traditionally on the margins of history, into the center of the frame in large-scale canvases with searing color and drips of linseed oil that are like a veil of tears or a screen, connecting the viewer to history and also creating a sense of distance so that we want to tease out who these portraits are of, what was their story. And in the context of the National Portrait Gallery, her work makes a loud and powerful impact. You walk through some of our galleries of 19th century portraits, which are very academic and formal, and find her work to be quite a contrast to those portraits. And at the National Portrait Gallery, we're proud to open narratives of history, to tell stories that have been overlooked or buried, and bring those stories to light. Hung Lu once said, "I want my work to be a comfort to people I have never known." And while she is no longer here with us, her work continues to be a source of comfort and strength. For Hung Lu, engaging with portraiture was always an act of empathy. During her life, she paid tribute to hundreds of individuals through her practice of expanding upon photographic imagery to create complex, multi-layered paintings. She observed, quote, "History is not a static image or a frozen story. It is always flowing forward." And I love that she described history as a verb. Lu, who was born in Changchun, China, experienced political revolution, exile, and displacement before immigrating to the United States in 1984. She came of age during Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, and was consequently forced to labor in the fields for 4 years in her early 20s. In 1984, after studying art in Beijing, Lu left China to attend graduate school at the University of California, San Diego. There, the experimental tendencies of fellow students and faculty members, such as the foundational performance artist Allan Kaprow and the feminist art historian Maura Roth, cultivated her conceptual approach to portraiture. And I want to talk more about that because Hung Lu was always experimental, even before she left China, when she was forced to study in a socialist realism mode. She was always looking for more creative ways to portray people and to portray her experiences. Lu's portraits of promised lands represent her family members as well as anonymous subjects. Over the course of 5 decades, she portrayed refugees, women soldiers, migrant laborers, prostitutes, orphan children, and other overlooked individuals whom she described as lost souls or spirit ghosts. Lu reimagined their stories and honored them with her brush. And just to begin, I want to take you into the exhibition for a little sneak peek into the galleries, but it's nothing like being there in person. So I hope that all of you will have a chance to visit the National Portrait Gallery before the exhibition closes in May 2022. This is the first gallery, which includes self-portraits and portraits of Hung Lu's family members. And this is another view looking into the gallery of family portraits. You see the portrait of her grandfather, Lu Huihua. And you also see portraits of some of the women that she portrayed in the gallery devoted to her representations of gender and her concept of gender, which she described as coming from China and from ancient Chinese poetry and literature, such as the Ballad of Mulan. And we also have portraits of refugees. One of the galleries is devoted to the theme of refugees, which was a focus of Hung Lu's throughout her career. So if Phil Tinari and Ying-chen Peng could turn on your cameras, we will begin the discussion. And I have to say a special thanks to Philip Tinari, who's here at the early hours of the morning from Beijing. So good morning, Philip, and good evening, Ying-chen. So happy to have you with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you, Dorothy and Kate.
So I wanted to begin with a question for Philip. Your catalog essay in the exhibition catalog opens with a vivid description of the exhibition you see pictured here, with the gathering that took place in 2008 just outside of Beijing, when Hung Lu was there to celebrate her exhibition, Prodigal Daughter. And you described the joy of her school friends who were there to celebrate her accomplishment, and her mother who was there to celebrate her daughter's work and who had written a book about Hung Lu's early life. And you talk about in your catalog essay what has happened in China since 2008, including your own rise from being a freelance art critic to the director of the UCCA. I'm interested to hear from you about how Hung Lu's place and the context of contemporary art in China has changed since this moment in 2008.
Sure. Well, that's a great place to start, and one of so many different angles that we could use to look at her and her many accomplishments in her time with us. That moment in 2008 for me was so poignant because it was just around the time I was getting to know Hung. I think I first met her in 2006. And in those early years, kind of before and just after the Beijing Olympics, she was there a lot. Her mom was still alive. They spoke every day until her mom passed away, which was not so many years ago. And whenever she had a chance, she and Jeff would travel to Beijing, and it was a time when things were seeming, and I see some old friends in the group here. Things really felt like they were opening up and moving in a more global direction. And so you had things like this gallery show in an old warehouse, on the outskirts of Beijing, and an artist who had left China in 1984, having multiple opportunities to show her work and convene with people she'd known during her time in China, but also new generations of artists and professionals and collectors. And I think it's hard to remember sometimes how it felt like things were going to move, uninterruptedly in that direction. Of course, the last 2 years have been a shock to all of us, but long before that, the dynamics were changing, and this idea of a great kind of convergence between China and the US, of sort of globalization more generally, was already being thrown into doubt. And so I always look back at that moment as just kind of one of many manifestations of, this earlier mindset. And I think one that she anticipated in having left when she did. And I guess the second part of your question, which is sort of where she fits in this story of contemporary Chinese art, however you may choose to define that. And it's quite interesting because, she leaves China really just as the kind of avant-garde movement of the 80s is gathering steam. And so she wasn't part of those kinds of conceptual experiments or underground exhibitions that happened in the 80s and in the 90s in China. Instead, she takes herself and directly puts herself into this whole other context that you just mentioned of San Diego in the 80s and the sort of beginnings of art making informed by new kinds of feminism and new kinds of ideas about identity. And it's a long road to bring that back to China and back into this conversation, that itself on the ground in China follows a steady but sort of slower and longer trajectory. And yet at every turn, still kind of inflected by these extremely human connections. I mean, I think about her relationship to artists in China like Sui Jianguo, or like the painter couple Liu Xiaodong and Yu Hong. People who studied at the same academy that she went to, who knew her, from her early days hosting a television program about painting before she left, who looked up to her as a kind of big sister figure, even if she was only just a few years older than they were. But that's sort of how, generational dynamics play out. And then I also think about, much younger artists in the same trajectory, in the same schools, making careers in similar ways to how she might have had she been 20 or 30 years younger, who didn't really have the pleasure or the privilege to know her or know much about her work because of these very attenuated ways in which the story here is told. So she's this just such an inspiring figure. I mean, I found myself about a week ago in conversation with a female painter of my generation who also went to the Central Academy, who's also from the west side of Beijing, and I'm there like explaining who is this person, Hong Liu, and I was completely shocked that her name is Liang Yuanwei. She paints kind of generally abstract flowers and patterns and things. And it was this revelation as she realized that there had been this kind of person who trodden this path before her. I think that's common to the way art history is kind of practiced here, or the way that the story is sometimes passed down. So I guess I looked at this moment in 2008 as one in which, that things could have reunited in a certain way, maybe did for a moment, and one which seems very, very rare and precious to us, 12 years later, 13 years later.
Thank you. I love how you mentioned that the younger generation of artists, and even some who are just slightly behind her, talk about her in terms of being sort of an older sister figure and paving the way. We're making a tribute video to her that will include the voices of the artists, both in China and in the United States, who wrote about her for our catalog. And what I'm hearing from them over and over again is that she opened doors. And she did this not only for Chinese contemporary artists, but for younger artists in the United States and her contemporaries. So she really did have a way of kind of breaking new ground that continues, and I have a feeling it will continue as time passes and as more people get to know her work. This is a slide, Phil, that you included in your catalog essay, and I just wanted you to address these two images. One is by Hong Liu from her Where's Mao series.
Yeah, I mean, I just thought these are interesting because they were created in the same year, which is 1988. And the one on the left is Wang Guangyi, who's kind of one of the best known contemporary Chinese artists of that generation that emerges, before and after Tiananmen in 1989. And what he's done is kind of taken, what's called the standard portrait of Mao and put him behind this grid. The joke is that these grids were kind of what were used to fabricate these images at scale and at velocity around China, throughout the Cultural Revolution and afterwards. But here the grid becomes a kind of cage. And you have this kind of conceptual language play with the letters A and O going on in the corners. And then what Hung did is something quite similar, but quite personal. It's a different kind of effacement. She's literally, not filled in the features on the Mao figure. Of course, we know exactly who it is, commemorating this. And it's a whole series of kind of vignettes, almost like a comic book of, stages from scenes from the life of the great leader as he goes about his business. But I just thought, I don't know, I just thought these were kind of like related, but different kinds of effacement. And I think also just speaking to how for artists of that generation, I mean, born the year before the founding of the People's Republic in Hung's case, we have to acknowledge what a massive topic this was, and what how much symbolic work needed to be done to just kind of come to terms with and get past, those early years, and yet not slip into oversimplifying, what that relationship might be like.
Yes, and the entire Where is Mouse series is installed in our corridor in the exhibition. So you could see the entire series, which she described as an anti-monument. Ying-chen, I wanted to ask you about Hung and feminism. Hung Lu often described her version of feminism as one that comes from China, and she spoke about the importance of the female characters in ancient literature and poetry, which I mentioned before, such as the Ballad of Mulan. But she also talked about the importance of the women in her own family, her mother and her grandmother who raised her. I am curious to hear from you about how you see her feminism in the context of contemporary Chinese art.
Sure. So Dorothy, let me circle back to the point you made earlier that Hong Liu was an enthusiastic and warm artist who opened her doors to all. Because I remember that in 2018, when the Castle Museum at American University hosted an exhibition featuring her, our students wrote final papers on her works, and we sent the papers to Hong, and she actually wrote back to the students to communicate with students. So that was a very touching moment to both our students and for myself. And as for your question, I think it's a great one because Hong Liu is one of the few Chinese women artists of her generation, a generation that first grew up with and practiced the socialist ideal of women holding up, half of the sky. And she also has a very exceptional role model, Mulan. We all know that this character has a strong devotion to family, and she saved her family with her martial excellence, going to become a warrior instead of relying on feminine beauty. And I think this is definitely understandable because Mulan's image is consistent with the value that she grew up with. Can we go back to the previous slide, please? Thank you. So I imagine that one of the cultural shocks that Hong Liu experienced in her early years in the US is the hypersexualization of Asian women, which was non-existent in her upbringing, especially when you basically living up that motto, women holding up half of the sky. And I think she responded to it by changing her name into Fortune Cookie in this work, Resident Alien. That's one of her early works in the US. And we know that Fortune Cookie is an American invention, but it is also an ethnic slur that refers to Asian women. And I think from this point on, we do see a more enthusiastic energy channeled into the exploration of women in Chinese history and their social roles. So could you move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So what's really interesting to me is that unlike younger feminist artists in contemporary China who often use female sensibility and sensitivity to revolt against patriarchy, Hong's art emphasizes women's endurance and resilience in their social roles. It is especially powerful in her works of the quote-unquote silent mass, those nameless prostitutes, refugees, peasants, and even comfort women. So what we are seeing here is the wonderful installation in the gallery on view now. And I want to use the work to the right as an example. So what we see here is a multimedia installation divided into several sections. On canvas, it's divided into two parts. To the left, you see a colorful background, and against the background, a teacup with an erotic painting. So it shows you that the female body is the vessel of men's sexual pleasure. But in the other half, she gives you that bleak reality of women's suffering because the bound feet used to be the focus of sexual desire in pre-modern China. But here, what she does is to expose those 2 feet in a foreshortening technique to really emphasize those physical torture that women endured. But then her face doesn't really show you any like pain or extraordinary facial expression, as if it is a part of her reality. And then to the right, you see the broom. That also indicates the kind of domestic chores that women still have to do. So I think this is really an interesting case that speaks to her statement in one of the interviews that she wanted to reveal the pain that women endures. And this is definitely one of the powerful works that she created. Now, can we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So what I like on Hong Liu's art the most is that she does not stop there showing you the pain. She tries to move on to show us what can be done, what changes can be made. So the images from the old photographs acknowledges the suffering, but at the same time, when it fades into the past, under the linseed oil drippings, like what we see now, the image entitled "Comfort Women." The vibrant colors and new motifs home painted onto the canvas really gives it new life. So a quite interesting details is that we do see the drippings of linseed oil on the face and body of these young girls, as if washing away their image to blur it. But then we also see new motifs, especially the butterflies, caterpillar, painted after she used the linseed oil. So you see her intention of bringing newness to this old image. And another interesting motif on this painting to show her desire to put an end to it and open up a new conversation would be those circles you can see on the painting. In a previous interview, people were already very interested in what that motif means. And Hong replied that these circles, of course, they have many meanings, but to her, she used them because in Chinese writing, it is the shape of period mark. It is the end of something, but also it indicates the beginning of another new scenario. So I think here, Hong Liu is really trying to juxtapose the past with the present. And then even, she wants to send her blessing to the future. I think we can move on to the next slide to show you the installation view. So it is also a very important characteristic of Hong Liu's painting. They're usually very large, monumental, and it's related to her professional training background back in China as a mural painter. But by enlarging these insignificant images from small prints to large canvases in a museum, she set up a new monumentality to these figures and to these stories that they endured, so that they wouldn't be washed away in the flow of history. So that is also a very important contribution that Hong Liu made to the documentation of women's lives. Okay. Right, so next slide, I think we have something else to talk about. That is coming back to her role model, Mulan, because earlier I said about Mulan's one of her quality is her commitment to family. And I think here, this is another powerful image of Hong Liu's art that takes us to that topic, because her father was absent in the first half of her life. He was imprisoned the same year when she was born. So growing up, it was women in her family that really supported the family in all kinds of possible ways. And this painting entitled Munu, or mother and daughter, shows you two laborers, the boat haulers doing this kind of very masculine labor work. And what is really powerful is the rope that ties them. it's not only the symbol of that kind of hard labor, it is also that bond between mother and daughter. And the way they support their families is not in any conventional Chinese way of doing domestic chores or needleworks, but going out, selling their labors just like men. So this again resonates with the legend of Mulan, who refused the traditional path and or were forced to do something differently. But I think this is definitely a type of documentation that is quite rare in other Chinese women artists. And I think we have one more slide.
Yes.
Thank you. And I think Hong Liu finally found her modern Mulan models. So this is one painting from her 2007 series, China's Daughters. We were very fortunate to see the series at Kassel in 2016. That was a very powerful installation because it was inspired by a true historical event of a group of women soldiers in China fighting against the invading Japanese in 1938. When they lost the battle, instead of surrender, they actually chose to drown themselves in the river. And even though they failed in their mission, but the story became a great propaganda material. It resulted in the making of a film in 1949. This definitely inspired Hong Liu when she was trying to portray women as change makers. In this painting, what you see is a group of young women, but again, their faces are blurred. You can't really see their identity. And this is intentionally done, I believe, because she painted these works after the 1949 film, still not a real historical event, but she definitely captured that spirit. Because what you are seeing here in the historical narrative should be a dooming moment of committing suicide. But the atmosphere on painting is very different because what you see here is a lot of vibrant reflection of light and color and movement, as if these women were doing this, believing that they are doing the betterment for the world, for the future. And I believe that is Hong Liu's sincere take on women's role, that they can and they are the change makers. So I think to conclude my observation, I think Hong Liu definitely stands on a very unique position in contemporary Chinese art because, like I said earlier, unlike other artists who try to make this contrast between female and male, or to emphasize the female quality, she's really trying to find a universal common ground for both genders. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is absolutely fascinating. And she did talk about the making of this portrait or this painting with me. And she said when her mother would visit her studio, she would point to the two women depicted and tell her mother, that's us. Always thinking about her own experience and her own, the strength of the women in her own family. And then this is really for both of you, Philip and Ying-chen. She also talked about being seen as dangerous. And so in her Resident Alien self-portrait, she talks about being called an alien by the US government on her green card. And then she would say, what? I'm so scary. I'm so dangerous. But then Philip, she actually was censored in China when she was getting ready to return to open an exhibition in 2019 at the UCCA. The exhibition was canceled. And I wanted to ask you about that, about the danger of her work at this moment in China. And this is one of the works that would have been in your show that is in the show at the National Portrait Gallery, and it's her self-portrait called Avant-Garde.
Yeah, I mean, it was to our incredible regret, and it was I mean, I've written about it, and it's been discussed in various media, including the New York Times. But we worked hard to put together an exhibition of a selection of paintings that and installations actually that we thought would be particularly relevant to a public in Beijing, institutional public. The image I showed at the beginning was from a gallery show, right? So it was seen by people who are kind of, in the scene already, for better or worse. And it was also, a whole 12 years before the project we were planning. And the point of that exhibition, more than anything, was kind of to address like what I just said about that artist I spoke to last week, and to kind of short circuit this whole transmission and really make sure that her work was front and center before the Chinese art world and especially before younger kinds of practitioners. I mean, I think globally right now we're seeing a return to a kind of figuration, and a kind of figuration that's socially inspired and informed, and that addresses injustices. And so in that context, her work is in DC as well, extremely current. And so, yeah, that was really our starting point in organizing this exhibition called Passerby. And just so people understand how it works, to import art into China, you need a file, a license, essentially, that gives you the right to do that. And that's issued by the local Bureau of Culture. And that file, that letter was just never forthcoming. And you always know you're in trouble when you get to the end of the process and they say, we're convening a panel of experts to decide, if the letter should be issued, because when that happens, the answer is generally that it won't be issued. And so there was just no way to have the exhibition because the art couldn't enter the country. So we had to cancel it. And I did a lot of thinking in the wake of that about kind of like why her, because we often do, we often show work that is unexpected. I mean, to give a small example, we opened a major retrospective of Andy Warhol the day after the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party earlier this summer. So, what was it about her work that really raised red flags, to use a overdetermined metaphor? And I think it really is that this language of figuration, or even social realism, you might call it, is something that can be understood, sort of inside the official system. A lot of more conceptual work maybe flies over the heads of censors, or is seen as, unable to impact audiences in such a direct way. But I think, it's, in a way, it's a real credit to her work that even people in a bureaucratic situation who reviewed these kinds of applications immediately sensed, the power and the sort of subversiveness of the message there. And of course, they never tell you exactly which painting it was, but in a way, maybe it's kind of all of them. And so, yeah, so anyway, so that didn't happen. But yeah, I was at least happy to be able to write about it a little bit in the catalog essay for this exhibition, and to be part of this, which ends up being her very last show.
Well, and I'm so grateful for your essay and your documentation of that experience. And I'll never forget meeting you for the first time in person, Philip, in San Francisco, where we gathered with a group of her friends and supporters who had planned to travel to China for the opening of your show. And we had an uncensored party. But I'll never forget the look of devastation and sadness that she carried with her that night, because she did say, even my artist contemporaries in China don't understand why my work would be censored. So I think there was some feelings of confusion on her part about it, but she pushed on, as she always did. Ying-chen, I'm interested to hear your perspective on this from the feminist lens.
Well, to me, I think this slide already explains the sense of threat that the authority in China might have felt. Because first of all, yes, what we see is a robust, monumental self-portrait of a brave young woman, and even with the hint of being militant. Look at what she's carrying on. So this should look okay. It's in the style of socialist realism, and by everyone's common sense in China, it should be a political propaganda. But then here comes the problem: the background is removed. The context is now replaced by a blank white. It can be a warrior of anything. And this is a very direct way of expressing Hong Liu's devotion to herself and her to guard her own identity. But as to what this identity is and means, it is not necessarily what the Chinese authority might be interested in. So I suspect that this kind of individualism might also be touching the sensitive nerve of the authority. And from this perspective, I think it also shows you a kind of tension on the other side of the Pacific Ocean at the moment.
I want to just jump in really quickly too, because we can talk about this painting in so many ways, but there's an amazing joke just hidden right in clear sight that I think just bears mentioning. So if you look at the tip of her bayonet, you may notice that it's actually a sliver of Monet's, the painting that gives us the word impressionism, right? Impression Sunrise from 1876. And that comes from the story, as it was told to me, was at one point, looking at these photos, her husband, Jeff, asked her, so who exactly were you training to fight against, in these exercises? And she said, we were defending the homeland from foreign impressionists. And she actually meant imperialists. But anyway, so that explains that reference. I think it just speaks to how there was always, she was dealing with these great historical themes and tragedies and looking for the ways we create identities for ourselves and remember our forgotten. But there was also always this sense of humor kind of below it all that I don't think she ever lost.
I absolutely agree. And she spoke to her own experience and the history of China and her life during the Cultural Revolution in her work. But she also talked about creating this universal story and an epic history. And I show on the right an image of my daughter with avant-garde. Hong Liu liked to say, we can adopt each other's children. Why can't we adopt each other's ancestors? And she also talked about the self-portraits in the exhibition and the portraits of her family members as being images that we can all look to as our own family members. So she was always after while she would focus on the specific, she was always after the universal. And she would say, the more specific a face, the more universal it is. I am seeing so many questions coming into the chat. And so I want to shift to the audience and I will pull out some of the questions and please feel free to add more to the Q&A. I know we have limited time, but I want to try to get to as many as possible. Let's see. Here is one from Sabrina Lin. I always thought her early training at the Beijing Teachers College was interesting as a kind of artistic origin story. Could you speak about how teaching and her lifelong role as an educator factored into her practice? Ying-chen, would you like to take that one?
I think it's not my area of specialty, but I think these constant exchanges definitely mattered a lot because she shifted between the roles of being an educator and being a student, right? She received a full set of training back in China, but then she came to study at UC San Diego and she became a student again. So I think that definitely made her aware of the different approaches and becoming more open-minded in shifting between different styles. So the series that we didn't get to talk about is her latest series to rework on Dorothy Lang's works. And to everyone here, if you go to see the show, you will see a pretty obvious stylistic change between that series and the paintings we talk about today.
I think on that front too, I just to pick up on what Ying-chen was saying, I think it's also interesting, in a way that the best thing you could be coming out of a place like the Central Academy of Fine Arts was a professor at the Central Academy of Fine Arts. And it's interesting how, even she trades continents and comes to the US, but, becoming an art professor, I think was something that was kind of hardwired into her. But I think later on, it also just became this incredible vehicle for her generosity, which was, one of probably her most distinguishing character traits of all. And it was a structure by which she could continue to give to people and to just create this community around her. And Dorothy, you mentioned that evening we spent together in San Francisco when we all should have been in Beijing. And I was just so struck by how many former students were there and how many people's lives have been touched and changed. I'm sure there are some of them on the participant list right now as well.
Yes, and she grew up, she was raised by her mother, who was a teacher. Her grandfather was a teacher and scholar. One of the things that attracted me to her when we first met, when she was a juror for our 2013 Outwin Bucci portrait competition, was the way she talked about portraiture during the jury process. She was a natural teacher. And I thought of her not only as a brilliant artist, but as a mentor. I learned so much from her, and she was constantly available to answer questions and to provide more context and information. And I'm so touched now to be getting to know her son, Ying-chen, who is also a scholar and a teacher, and has done a lot to answer questions for me and to carry forth, her legacy as it relates to her family's history. So yes, that spirit of generosity runs deep in her family through the generations. Here is a question from Michael Carroll. Hi, Michael. What do Philip and Ying-chen believe will be Hung's legacy in China, given Beijing's prior permitting, but subsequent refusal in 2019? So her legacy.
I think you have to take a long view of these things. I mean, I imagine there will be a day when her work will be seen and discussed properly. And I think especially if you look, Dorothy mentioned this, but at the esteem she's held in by other artists in China. I don't know. I have to hold out hope that there's a moment when that contribution will be recognized in a proper way.
I take a more optimistic attitude because it's a global society. And in our past, in our teaching career, we are seeing a lot of international students coming, going, and her work, her art are being seen here extensively, not only by our own population, but also by these students from different countries, including China. And I think that's a alternative channel of spreading out her legacy to her homeland before we hear any good news from China. But I think her legacy will be seen if we utilize these global channels adequately.
Thank you. Another question, what aspects of Hung's work reflect her own experience as a refugee and then reflect her life as an artist in an American context? I mean, for those who don't know or maybe missed the beginning, her family fled Changchun in 1948 when she was an infant, in May of 1948. And her father, who was a captain in the Nationalist Army, was removed from the family. And she often told the story of learning about their experience when she was 6 years old, in a story that her mother told her, where she vividly recalled the details of that journey and remembered seeing a baby set down by the riverbank, and the mother went into the river and drowned herself. And Hung Lu said, "Did you ever consider leaving me by the river?" And her mother looked at her and said, "I don't know." And it's a story that haunted her. So in her portrayals of refugees, especially of women and children, she thought about that experience and her family's own journey as refugees and their survival.
I think you've answered the question beautifully.
Agreed.
Let's see, I'm thinking if we have one more question. We did get a question about her use of historical photographs, how she used them, whether she painted over them or whether she recreated them. And she did, and where she found them. So she was a student of history. She was passionate about history, and she really enjoyed digging into photographic archives. In 1991, she came upon a grouping of photographs of Chinese prostitutes from the late 19th century in Beijing, and she recreated those into large-scale portraits where she reframed the subject through cropping, through the linseed oil, which created a drip or a veil over the canvas, and architectural elements. Often she has installations which include architectural elements. And really what she's doing is giving honor back to the subjects, to the people who she saw in these photographs as at risk of being forgotten. She called them spirit ghosts. And then more recently, she was using Dorothea Lange's archive at the Oakland Art Museum. And she felt a deep connection to the subjects in Dorothea Lange's photographs from her own experience working as a migrant laborer. So even though she shifted her focus to American subjects, she felt that, you know, again, we're in an epic history. This is a story that is universal. And she felt a deep connection to Dorothea Lange subjects and to Dorothea Lange for honoring those people who had been on the margins of history and bringing their stories to light.
I think it's also just like interesting to think about the role that photography played, because it was not an obvious move from her training, right? I mean, the more orthodox kind of realism she came of age with was about live models or other ways of making composition. So then to really intentionally go through these archives and take these photographs as what her friend Ai Weiwei later called, you know, cultural ready-mades, to inform her painting practice. There's a certain, like, there's a conceptual impetus behind that move as well.
And I would just add one more point. I think it's also very personal, because in her personal history during the Cultural Revolution, they had, well, before the Cultural Revolution, they had a family tradition of going to a photo studio to take annual photographs, but then they had to destroy the majority of them. So I believe to the artist, photography had a very special place. It's both personal and also, you know, like what Phil mentioned, artistic.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And in the exhibition, we include a selection of her family photographs, studio portraits that she carried with her throughout her life. And they were actually pulled from albums during the Cultural Revolution by Hung Lu and her mother, and saved and protected. So there was always this, so they wouldn't be burned by the Red Guards. So she always had this perspective on photography as something that was dangerous. Something that, you know, photographs were rare. It's not like today where they're everywhere. For her, these were rare and precious documents of her family's history. And so when she discovered these archives of photographs of people who were at risk of being forgotten or unseen, she wanted to save them as well.
I'm back, unfortunately. I have the unfortunate responsibility of bringing us to a close. It's almost 6 p.m. But Dorothy, maybe I would love to hear your last words.
Well, I want to thank Ying-chen and Philip for being with us. I'm actually very moved by the scene behind you, Philip, because it looks like the sun has risen. And Hung used to always say the sun always rises. The sun also rises. During the pandemic, we would text all the time and she would say, we're going to get through this. The sun also rises, drawing on Hemingway. And here you are with the sun rising behind you. I feel she's with us, bringing us together from Washington to Beijing. So thank you both for being here. Thank you, Kate, for hosting this wonderful panel, and to Jackie for all your work behind the scenes. I'm really grateful. And I hope all of you will be able to come see the exhibition here in Washington.
I just want to thank our guests and also plug our upcoming programs. Please also remember the catalog. If you cannot come to the Portrait Gallery, we do have a beautiful exhibition catalog. The link is in the chat. And before ending, I would like to invite you all to join us again on Tuesday, October 5th for a Zoom, another Greenberg Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture titled Toward an African Methodist Episcopal Aesthetic Idol, Art and Images at Wilberforce University, 1863 to 1914. It's going to be presented by Dr. Melanie Harvey of Howard University and moderated by Dr. Martha S. Jones of Johns Hopkins University. So we hope you can join us. And in the meantime, we hope you have a great night. Thank you, everyone. Great morning if you're in China, in Beijing. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.